I'm Tucker, and welcome to a zoo of human hubris where the animals are never the true villains. From a man who believed he was untouchable enough to walk inside a tiger enclosure, to a cocky expert who learned that a snake bite doesn't care about your resume, turning him down in the most painful way possible. It was November 18th, 2014, on the frost-hardened outskirts of Brno, Czech Republic, where you don't need gore to feel doom. You just need a wet floor, a missing gate check, and a man who believed his 20 years of calm counted more than the predator's first second of impulse. Marek Vildan was 58 and had spent nearly 20 years at the facility working with large cats. His reputation was simple, calm, physically unhurried around animals that operated on instinct rather than instruction. He dismissed newer dual-lock verification requirements, telling junior staff that real experience lived in your hands, not in a checklist. Younger keepers found him difficult to challenge, which I guess is pretty common in every work. Now, apparently, an understaffed crew was rotating enclosures that morning. A younger employee, working one gate ahead of where he believed Marek to be, left the secondary sliding gate between the transfer lane and the male tiger pen unsecured. Now, this assumption wasn't unreasonable. It was wrong. Marek entered the concrete service corridor carrying a hose and a metal rake. Rokan, a 520-pound male tiger, still occupied the transfer lane on the other side of that unsecured gate. The floors were slick with freezing rain, and Rokan had been pacing the transfer lane for several minutes before Marek entered, according to a keeper watching from an adjacent observation window. CCTV footage showed Marek stop when he saw the tiger. He did not retreat. He raised one hand and appeared to shout a familiar verbal command, like that scene in Jurassic World. Arrogance towards an apex predator like that doesn't come cheap, and boy did Marek pay for it. Rokan came through the gate in a single motion. Rokan took Marek by the shoulder and upper neck and dragged him laterally across the wet floor. The keeper at the adjacent window described a low, continuous growl and said Marek did not cry out. A staff member in the main corridor reportedly laughed before realizing Marek's body was largely unresponsive. Rokan clamped onto the throat and shook once, violently. The motion tore open the right side of Marek's neck. A keeper tried slamming a steel divider closed. Another struck the enclosure bars repeatedly with a shovel. Neither stopped the animal. Security footage showed Marek's arm move once before his head struck a concrete threshold during a second shake. I don't think Marek panicked. I think he believed in those first seconds that his experience still meant something. That's the specific tragedy of being very good at something for a very long time. A veterinary responder fired a tranquilizer dart approximately 4 minutes after contact. Emergency crews arrived 11 minutes after the initial radio call. Marek was pronounced dead inside the service corridor. The facility suspended tiger operations for 3 weeks. Internal review distributed blame across multiple protocol failures, including the unsecured secondary gate left open during the enclosure rotation earlier that morning. The younger employee involved was reportedly removed from animal transfer duties pending retraining. The tiger was not euthanized. I'm not sure what it says about how we account for deaths in places most of us only ever see through glass. But Marek walked into that corridor with 20 years of trust in himself, the one variable nobody had checked. What a way to start it off, huh? Now you might find the next one frustrating, because he'd already been warned once that day, and he still got out of the car. It was July 9th, 2016, in a safari zoo park in South Africa. Now, before we continue, I have to ask, have you ever watched someone make the same mistake 3 times in a single day, each time a little worse than the last? This is that story. Tobias Aaron was 34. A diesel mechanic from Stuttgart who had just finalized a divorce in March and responded by driving alone through southern Africa for 2 months. Now, it's not particularly clear if that had something to do with the incident, but I'll let you decide. And somewhere in Namibia, photography became his new obsession. He filled memory cards with animals he had no business being near and posted dozens of shots online during the trip. However, each one was closer than the last. Earlier that same day, rangers at the park had already stopped him once near an elephant cluster on the Northern Loop Road. He had been leaning through the window frame with a long lens. He acknowledged the warning, drove on, and apparently recalibrated nothing. Less than 2 hours later, staff warned him again after he partially opened his vehicle door near a cheetah crossing to steady a photograph. Dashcam footage later showed his rental SUV repeatedly stopping along the southern grass corridor. lingering far closer to the lions than other drivers considered safe. That was the third escalation. He was likely looking for something specific. He was looking for the shot. Traffic slowed near a section of tall yellow grass around 5:40 p.m., where a pride had been reported resting through the afternoon. The light was low and warm. Tobias exited his vehicle on foot carrying his camera, despite audible objections from at least 2 other tourists in nearby vehicles. In an apex country, you have to understand how crazy that is. He ignored direct warnings and bet his safety on the delusion that a wild pride stillness meant submission. He crouched roughly 20 feet off the road edge, shooting toward a partial shape visible through the grass. One driver later told investigators Tobias had said the animals looked too settled to bother. Oh, he was so wrong about that. The lioness that came out of the grass covered the distance before most witnesses processed that she had moved at all. She hit him from behind at full speed and drove him face first into the ground. She immediately bit down onto the back of his shoulder and neck region. His screaming brought the rest of the pride within seconds. 2 subadult males and a second adult female entered from the grass within roughly 4 seconds of the initial strike. Drivers began blasting their horns as the pride dragged Tobias roughly 15 feet into the grass. One tourist trapped inside a nearby van recorded the attack while crying and reporting the location to Park Dispatch. At that point, honking horns and a camera phone were the only things anyone could offer him, really. A ranger response unit arrived approximately 8 minutes after the emergency call was placed, firing warning shots and cracker shells to move the pride. Tobias was found with severe injuries to the neck, shoulder, and upper chest, along with multiple broken ribs. Rangers believed he had died within the first 2 minutes of the attack. The section of the safari road was temporarily closed afterward, while park officials reviewed safety procedures and witness footage from the scene. I've read a lot of accounts like this, and I still don't fully understand how someone hears a ranger's warning in the morning and interprets it as optional by afternoon. However, unlike Tobias, this next guy wasn't chasing anything. He was just doing his job, in the rain, at 2 in the morning, and had no idea what was already waiting for him on the other side of a gate. It was March 3rd, 2017, just past 2 in the morning at a zoological facility in Singapore, when the kind of night that should have ended without incident simply didn't. Naren Pillai, 46, worked overnight security at the facility after leaving a shipping logistics career years earlier. There's not much online about him. However, what I do know is that night, heavy monsoon rain flooded service corridors near the Hippo Canal system. Maintenance crews had cleared debris from a drainage route earlier that evening and left one transfer gate on a temporary latch, flagged for morning follow-up. Not negligence exactly, just the weight of small decisions that each looked reasonable alone. Around 2:10 a.m., Naren radioed metallic banging near the maintenance gate. Several pathway lights had failed in the storm, already a red flag, but he still kept walking. CCTV showed him moving alone through ankle-deep water with a flashlight and radio against all protocol. Now, was he brave? Sure, but is he smart? Absolutely not. Based on his patrol history, walking toward the sound was entirely consistent with how he operated, which is precisely the problem. The canal corridor ran roughly 50 feet, bordered by a concrete retaining wall. Water crossed the pathway at shin height. The banging, investigators concluded, was the gate shifting under a female hippopotamus that had partially pushed through while moving between flooded sections of the enclosure. The gate had been forced several inches wider by flood pressure after its latch failed under water load, creating enough space for the animal to wedge forward during the rising flow. Naren was approaching in the dark, believing a loose panel was slamming in the wind and that the hippos were secured in their indoor holding pool above the floodline, which is why the corridor was not treated as actively dangerous at that moment. Little did he know, he was about to face a nightmare. The audio recording from Naren's radio is the clearest account of what followed. A single scream, then heavy splashing. The animal lunged forward with open jaws, clipping him and pinning him hard against the concrete wall with its head and upper body mass. Before he could recover or pull away, it apparently bit into his midsection with full force. Now you have to understand that hippos don't attack to feed, they crush. The animal pinned him and applied full jaw pressure repeatedly. The colleague called for backup the moment the shape resolved, but several seconds passed before he understood what he was seeing. He later described those seconds as the worst of his life. 2 responders reached the canal approximately 6 minutes after the radio transmission. Firearms weren't authorized inside the facility overnight, so workers used floodlights and air horns to push the animal back. Naren was transported to a hospital trauma unit and died shortly after arrival. The coroner noted catastrophic blunt force trauma combined with massive internal hemorrhage, consistent with repeated compression and crushing injuries, multiple rib fractures, ruptured abdominal organs, and severe internal bleeding. The immediate cause of death was hemorrhagic shock secondary to these injuries, but in my opinion, the real cause was hubris, the quiet workmanlike arrogance of a man who'd walked toward trouble 100 times without following proper protocol, and walked away unharmed, so he assumed the 101st would be no different. The facility quietly upgraded its flood barriers and emergency lighting in the months that followed. Investigators also cited the failed temporary gate latch as a contributing factor in the incident. Okay, so this next one genuinely gets under my skin, because this guy wasn't even supposed to be there. He naively volunteered. It was September 14, 2015, at a large open-range wildlife safari park outside Valencia, Spain. You wouldn't have noticed anything unusual if you'd been there that morning, but neither did the people whose job it was to notice. Ivan Sorel was 41 and had been driving educational trams through the safari route for 2 years, coming to the job after a decade as a bus mechanic. But get this, he held no animal handling credentials and was not formally cleared for direct intervention with large wildlife. And not only that, several co-workers noted a consistent pattern. When animals got caught in fencing, Ivan moved toward them faster than the situation called for. And the surprising thing, nobody seemed to push back on it. Overnight winds had bent a section of outer perimeter fencing inward near the antelope holding corridor. By morning inspection, a male eland had caught its horns in loose cable wire and was pulling against it repeatedly. An eland weighs close to 1,400 pounds and stands nearly 6 feet at the shoulder. The correct response was to wait for veterinary staff. However, Ivan volunteered before they arrived, and a shift miscommunication combined with the absence of a clear veterinary sign-off led to him proceeding without explicit authorization, while his supervisor did not even intervene in time to stop it. I think about that supervisor's call more than I think about Ivan's. The animal's head was low, its resistance slow. Ivan moved in with hand pliers and worked through the wire strands one by one. The first tram of the morning had stopped nearby, passengers recording from roughly 30 yards out. The light was cool and flat. Acacia shadows still lay long across the enclosure floor. Nothing about the scene would have looked dangerous to anyone who didn't understand what an eland can do once it stops being exhausted. When the final strand snapped, the eland surged after a brief rebalancing shift as the tension released unevenly through the horns and wire. One horn caught Ivan in the lower abdomen and followed an oblique tearing path, exiting near his right hip after internal resistance redirected the force. But the goring isn't even the worst part. The impact actually lifted him off the ground. He hit the bent fence post behind him and came down on the dirt road, hands moving to his midsection. The eland continued kicking in the immediate area in panic. A second handler drew the animal away using a utility vehicle. Multiple tourists had already called emergency services. However, he lost consciousness before reaching the main gate and died in transit. The coroner determined death resulted from hemorrhagic shock due to penetrating abdominal trauma, including perforation of the small intestine and partial laceration of the iliac artery. The park revised its fence incident procedures afterward, requiring veterinary staff present before any worker approached entangled large game, and formalizing a mandatory vet-led authorization chain before any direct human intervention could occur. Coverage stayed regional and brief. You know why this story didn't get more attention? Because I think nobody wants to say the quiet part out loud. A man died because he thought he was smarter than an animal. But to be honest with Ivan, you could see the moment everything went wrong. However, this next one, the moment had already passed before anyone realized it. It was August 2nd, 2013, at a licensed wildlife park outside Darwin, Australia. A road trip detour that ended as the kind of event the people who witnessed it would carry with them indefinitely. A 17-year-old junior from Queensland, named Anthony Underwood, had come to the park with 3 classmates during a school break. His friends would later describe him the way you might describe a lot of teenagers: loud, impulsive, and always filming risky stunts for private chats. This was years before short-form video made that behavior mainstream. He'd never suffered a serious injury. You already know that he was reckless in that plain, familiar way that only shows itself when someone is watching. The group reached the saltwater crocodile exhibit. Near closing time, the primary resident was a 15-foot male. Double fencing and warning signs enclosed the area, but an older viewing platform section had uneven landscaping outside the primary fence line, where decorative rock bordered a drainage strip adjacent to the public railing leading toward the inner barrier zone. Witnesses told investigators Anthony said the animals looked half dead. One friend dared him to touch the inner fence for a photo. "I want to be careful putting this on the friend alone, but a raised phone and a waiting audience at 17 has its own gravity. The Darwin dry season holds the afternoon light flat and pale. The pond was still, surface catching low-angle sun. Several visitors were already at the elevated railing above the exhibit, phones raised. Security footage showed Anthony stepping over the outer railing while laughing. He planted his foot on the wet decorative rock between the barriers. The rock was slick from a recent keeper rinse. His foot went sideways. He dropped approximately 8 feet into shallow water inside the enclosure. The 15-foot male reached him before he surfaced. Witnesses on the platform above described a single hard impact, the sound arriving before the screaming did. The animal had his left leg. Witnesses described it pulling him laterally in violent, irregular surges driven by its body weight and grip toward the center of the pond. What followed was not fast. The crocodile initiated a death roll. Witnesses described Anthony briefly surfacing before going under again. Staff reached the outer railing and deployed flotation poles into the water. A second crocodile entered the pond almost immediately, making any personnel entry impossible. The water had gone dark red from the far end outward. Witnesses on the platform described the first animal resurfacing with part of Anthony's torso still in its jaws. A park employee placed the emergency call approximately 6 minutes after the initial alarm. Specialist handlers arrived shortly after, but could not safely approach the enclosure. Police and wildlife rangers arrived nearly 20 minutes later. However, all they could do was recover Anthony's remains from the far end of the enclosure. I keep thinking about those 20 minutes and what they mean when the water is already that color. The coroner documented fatal trauma consistent with large predator attack, catastrophic lower limb avulsion, severe thoracic injury, and blood loss incompatible with survival. The park installed taller anti-climb barriers and additional secondary fencing within weeks. What I can't resolve is the maintenance gap. That corridor had existed for years without modification. It is easier to frame this entirely as a story about a reckless teenager making a foolish choice. I don't think that framing is fully honest. The warning signs were posted, the gap was still there. You might want to believe the first one was a fluke of teenage stupidity and bad zoo maintenance, but the next one is just as stupid. It was March 14th, 2019, at a wildlife safari park outside Nairobi, Kenya, when a morning that had begun like hundreds before, it ended in a way that no one who witnessed it would ever be able to set down. Deborah Vance was 54, from Scottsdale, Arizona, and from the get-go, witnesses said she had opinions about everything: the length of the queue, the temperature of her complimentary bottled water, the fact that the safari vehicles were smaller than advertised. She had filed 2 complaints before 9 a.m. She had also been told, twice, that the restricted zones were restricted. She had nodded at both warnings the way people nod when they have already decided not to listen. The facility used a scheduled rotation to move animals between enclosures and secondary containment before extended public hours. Management had posted clear signage and stationed a guide specifically near the Eastern Bull Corridor that morning. The signage was in English, Swahili, and Mandarin. Deborah had photographed one of the signs for her Instagram story and captioned it, "So many rules," before ducking under the barrier rope. The decision to enter the restricted zone was entirely, unambiguously hers. And here is where I want you to stop and sit with something. Arrogance is not always loud. Sometimes it is a woman stepping over a rope because she has decided, somewhere beneath conscious thought, that rules exist for other people, people less experienced, less well-traveled, less deserving of an unobstructed photo. Around 9:40 a.m., Deborah separated from her guided group and entered a restricted transfer corridor between the indoor holding stalls. She had already passed pressure washing equipment and workers wearing ear protection, both standard indicators of an active large animal zone. The area was clearly off limits to visitors. A rope barrier, warning sign, and guide instructions were all in place. The corridor was roughly 5 feet wide, bordered by steel barriers and reinforced concrete. Deborah was filming on her phone when Haroon entered behind her at a slow walking pace. There was no charge or vocalization over the machinery noise. A worker farther down the hallway spotted the animal first and screamed. By the time Deborah turned, Haroon had already closed the distance. The elephant used its body weight to pin her against the barrier, fracturing multiple ribs on impact. Her phone slid across the concrete floor. The recovered video later captured 47 seconds of ceiling tiles and machinery noise. The elephant did not pull back. He continued pressing forward with steady, uninterrupted weight. A worker moved to trigger the emergency gate closure, but Haroon's body partially blocked the mechanism. The gate did not close as designed due to obstruction of the safety sensor zone. Blood appeared in her mouth within 90 seconds. Workers attempted intervention using pressurized water and loud acoustic deterrent signals. Physical separation took nearly 3 minutes. Responders arrived 7 minutes after the first radio call. Deborah Vance was pronounced dead at the scene. Death resulted from internal hemorrhage. Sometimes every sign was posted, every warning was given, every barrier was placed exactly where it needed to be, and someone decided they knew better. The safari park conducted an internal review. No procedural violations were found on the part of staff. Haroon was not relocated. Deborah's adult daughter, who had been on the same tour and had stayed with the group, gave a statement to park officials that afternoon. Ready for another story of hubris gone absolutely wrong. It was May 28, 2018, at an aviary zoo in far north Queensland. The morning was dense with humidity before 7, and something inside the enclosure had already shifted in a way nobody stopped to name. Darian McIntosh, 39, was a freelance wildlife photographer with a decade of shooting birds for tourism boards and publishers. He was known for precise, patient work and, less publicly, for the quiet certainty that he understood animals better than the people paid to manage them. The cassowary shoot was his anchor spread for a conservation magazine, the kind that could move him into a wider market. He'd arranged early access before public hours under staff-supervised conditions. Handlers briefed him at the gate. Stay behind the 40-foot safety line. No crouching beyond marked zones. No direct eye contact. The male had been territorial for weeks. Breeding season. The instructions were specific, repeated, and signed for. Darian listened with the slight tilt of a professional indulging amateurs. Footage from a fixed enclosure camera later showed Darian moving steadily deeper into the walkthrough as the morning progressed. The foliage near the safe shooting corridor was likely too dense for usable shots, or rather not dense enough to challenge someone of his reflexes. He crouched at roughly 40 feet from the entrance, just inside the restricted boundary line, but still within an area staff were expected to actively monitor and enforce facing the male directly. I think about the handlers watching that footage and wonder at what point they felt certain this was going to end badly. The enclosure was dense and loud with bird calls, the kind of sound that fills space and obscures lateral movement. The male had been visible near the tree line when Darian entered. By the time he had reached the palm cluster, the bird had moved. The male came from behind the palms without vocalization. One handler described it as simply appearing at close range, already moving. The bird struck Darian in the chest and knocked him backward. He got partially upright before the cassowary began kicking downward with its inner claw. The first strike opened his upper thigh. Both handlers moved in with barrier shields and audible deterrent devices, but the bird did not disengage immediately due to proximity confinement within the narrow enclosure corridor. Darian fell against a tree root, and the cassowary raked his groin and lower abdomen in 2 distinct rapid bursts, separated by brief repositioning. That one made me recoil when reading it for the first time. One handler described blood reaching the broad leaves of nearby ground plants. The other used a reinforced separation shield to push the bird laterally toward the fencing line, while the first triggered the enclosure alarm. The attack lasted approximately under 2 minutes of active contact spread across several short engagement bursts. One handler called emergency services immediately after the bird was secured and the inner gate locked. A medical helicopter was dispatched. Darian died before it could land. Blood loss was unsurvivable within the available response window. I keep returning to that gate briefing. The handlers were clear. The risk was documented, and Darian advanced anyway, not from recklessness, but because the photograph required standing somewhere he had been told not to stand, and because he had spent years being right about those calculations. He likely thought he understood birds. He did not understand this one. Now our last story features a guy who wasn't careless in the way you'd expect. He was fast, he was confident, and for years that was exactly what kept him alive, until it couldn't. It was October 11th, 2016, inside the reptile division of a mid-sized zoological facility in Leipzig, Germany. A Tuesday afternoon, ventilation repairs completed, African specimens waiting to be returned to their enclosures, but hubris would get in the way. Sven Oltmar was 31 and had worked the reptile division for 4 years after completing animal care training at a vocational college. His colleagues regarded him as competent but impatient. A supervisor had flagged his habit of skipping spotters in writing and twice in direct conversation. Facility policy required a second trained handler for venomous species transfers, but this was often bypassed during workload pressure. He was fast in a way that had never cost him anything before. 2 written warnings, 2 direct conversations, and still he walked like policy was a suggestion box. That's not speed. That's ego with a pulse. That afternoon, Sven was responsible for returning several African species to their primary enclosures following the ventilation work. A co-worker later told investigators he overheard Sven say that one of the snake transfers would take only 30 seconds, that calling in a spotter would take longer than the procedure itself. That kind of reasoning is how most of these stories begin. The adult specimen was a black mamba, roughly 6 feet long. CCTV footage showed the animal thrashing and coiling rapidly against the restraint hook during handling, before Sven attempted a direct manual control of the posterior body, while the head remained on the hook, reaching for the tail with his free hand. The bite landed between the thumb and index finger of his left handling glove. The craziest part? He did not stop working. Next thing his coworkers saw was him at a labeling station several minutes later, sweating heavily, struggling to sequence transport tags. One described his movements as deliberate in a way that looked like concentration. When asked, Sven said the bite had likely come from a juvenile cobra housed nearby, and that the glove had prevented deep penetration. Staff began retrieving polyvalent elapid antivenom from controlled refrigerated storage following initial uncertainty about species identification. The mamba enclosure went unchecked. That confusion over which snake, which anti-venom, is what the next 40 minutes cost him. Over the following minutes, documented on facility footage and witness statements, Sven's speech became slurred. He sat against the corridor wall. A co-worker knelt beside him and noted breathing had grown shallow. A second staff member confirmed the mamba transport container was empty. Sven was by then on the floor, losing muscular control in his limbs. The correct antivenom was not administered until roughly 40 minutes after the bite, delayed by the initial misidentification and time lost verifying venomous species and retrieving the appropriate stored antivenom dose under controlled access procedures. Sven suffered respiratory arrest and died at a university hospital that evening. The facility updated venomous reptile transfer protocols to require mandatory secondary verification during all mamba handling. The change was implemented quietly. I want you to imagine those 8 minutes at the labeling station. The window was already closing, and everyone around him thought he was just focused on his work.